Hey everyone, this is a bit of a longer video, but it's been requested a few, and I'm already doing these little QA videos, so why not? Some people have asked me what are the categories, and a brief explanation of them for regards to how we review the games. We've spent the better part of the last 7 years coming up with a very extensive list of categories for things to gauge and review as a way to kind of standardize, but also not to smash every game into the same bucket, but more to help prompt thoughts across all of gaming, right? And every now and again, we add a new category as well, a new column in the sheet, if you will. I actually have a massive spreadsheet here for both the story axis and the gameplay axis, and I thought I'd go through these really quickly here. So let's start with story. I'll just be doing these in alphabetical order because that's how I have them listed. Animation. This usually falls under something like motion capture when it comes to modern games, but it has to do with how much the body language and motion of the particular characters or the movement of items or whatever adds to the overall narrative impact. Maybe someone kind of having a good visual representation of how much of a scene is impacting them. Maybe even something as simple as how much the backdrop is animating in order to add to how believable it is. These are both things that fall under animation. Atmosphere and tone is fairly obvious. From Dark Souls and its gloomy doomy to something more bright and cheery like a Dragon Quest game, atmosphere is exactly how much of that atmosphere adds to or detracts from a given game. Babylon 5 effect. This is probably one of the ones that people have most of a question about. Babylon 5 effect refers to a specific variant of foreshadowing in which when you watch or play through a work one time, it's one thing, but then when you go back and replay it, it's a completely different thing. It's harder to write than simple foreshadowing because of the fact that it has to be visible from both perspectives equally. That's Babylon 5 effect. Background lore. This is kind of a catch-all. There's a lot of things that can contribute to background lore. Maybe just little descriptors on items, maybe people chatting in the background. Maybe there's like a signpost you can see that reads something. Maybe there's like a newspaper you can pull up periodically. Just little background stuff that helps flesh out the events as you're going. Banter. Banter is usually between characters, almost always between characters. But it can be a character talking to themselves, like in the Batman games or in the Witcher games, for example. Good banter is awesome and almost always adds to a scene. Bad banter almost always distracts from it and makes you go, just shut up. So, there's banter. Branching narrative. This is, God, it's extraordinarily rare for games we cover. In fact, at a glance, have we ever, under the current system? Yes, we have given a positive once. Nope. Twice. 3 times. Oh my God. 4 positives. Holy crap. For branching narrative. It's very rare, because most games don't actually have branching narrative. And, of course, what I mean by that is when this narrative goes off in a completely different direction, not merely just another variant on the same general type of quest. In Dragon Age Inquisition, choosing between the mages and the Templars is not a branching narrative. By contrast, the way that the story can completely unfold in a totally different way in, say, Sunless Sea or Pathologic, that's branching narrative. Brickwork. This also qualifies for sprite work. The term brickwork comes from the nature of designing sprites back on the NES and the SNES era, but the term still applies regardless of the type of game it is. It's the visuals in the background and how much they add to the atmosphere and immersion of the scene. How much do you feel like you're actually there based on those visuals? It's an all-important aspect of game design that is often ignored, in my honest opinion, and is something I am really, really big on, because while most games have some degree of brickwork, the games that really nail it just look so good and feel so much better as a consequence of that. Camera work. Same general idea as animation, but specifically with the camera. Really good camera work can really add to a scene, whether it's it's the panning up or the looking down or the slow kind of pan side or slow zoom kind of a thing. It can also really detract from a scene. So that's the other side of that. Characters. This should be obvious. Are characters good? Are characters bad? Cutscenes. Again, obvious. Good cutscenes, bad cutscenes. Consequent storytelling. This one's a little bit more ephemeral. The idea behind consequent storytelling is it should feel like if you are going through the game or story and things unfold in a logical way and acknowledge the events, they have consequences, things happen, and then those have a knock-on effect in a way that adds to the narrative, that makes it feel more believable or more reasonable, that's consequent storytelling. Cutscene incompetence. This one should be self-explanatory. I'm sure you've seen this before because it's a plague on fiction. How many times have you seen the person being like, "Oh my God, they're doing this horrible thing. They're shooting that poor innocent stuffed animal, and I'm just gonna sit here staring at them, doing nothing, with the bow on my back, ready to..." No, they just sit there. It's cutscene incompetence. It's exactly what it sounds like. Dialogue. Obvious. Good dialogue, bad dialogue. Doodads. I didn't come up with that word. Blizzard actually came up with the term doodads. Doodads is very related to brickwork, but in a different field. Brickwork has to do with the general visual design and in some cases effects of the background. Doodads has to do with the specific placement of detailing, which makes it feel like a real place. You can have good brickwork with nice, fancy, textures on the ground and textures on the wall and stuff like that, but there's nothing there. And you could also have games that don't really have really good brickwork, but have very excellent doodad design, where you could see there's a pot and maybe a piece of bread right next to it, and there's a half-eaten piece of bread right next to a bowl that has a few breadcrumbs in it, and there's a spoon right next to it. It's kind of fallen out of it, and it's got a little bit of stuff. All of that stuff, all those little extra doodads, that adds to a scene as well and makes it feel like a real place. Doodad design is critical and also really, really hard to do, which is why I value it so much. Empty text. Persona 5 gave us this term. Empty text is when someone talks extensively and says nothing. It is a narrative form of padding. You probably know what I'm talking about now that I said it that way. External continuity. How well does a given work use something outside of the work for its own narrative benefit? Usually this is like sequels get this kind of thing. It's like, how well does Dragon Age 2 use Dragon Age Origins, for example? But it can be part of a franchise. How well does KOTOR use Star Wars as a whole? This can be both good and bad, and is not necessarily related to retcons. All that matters is this work improved or detrimented by use of external continuity? Fake drama, also known as melodrama, also known as drama. This is always a negative category because it's always bad, and I don't feel the need to explain that. Foreshadowing is obvious. Good foreshadowing is good. Bad foreshadowing is obvious. Humor, obvious. Integration segregation. This is actually kind of a rare one. The idea is, how many times does the gameplay and the story integrate perfectly to then tell the narrative and improve the gameplay experience? Generally speaking, a gameplay and story integration positive goes to both axes simultaneously. Not always. Internal continuity. How well does the game keep track of its own works, about stuff that happens within it? This is related to consequent storytelling, but not quite the same. Intro. So intro is vague. Intro is the early part of a game, but when an intro cuts off depends wildly. Sometimes an intro can be 30 seconds. Sometimes it can be several hours. It varies. It depends. How long that is doesn't really matter. What matters is how good of a job it does at hooking the player. I'm always harsher about intros and outros, because intros, you have to have something to really get the player's interest, and outros, you have to stick the landings, because that's the last thing the player's going to experience, and as a consequence, it's going to stick with it the longest. So, very harsh about intros. Lighting. Lighting is related to brickwork and camera work and doodads, but in this case, how well does the lighting actually add to a scene? Usually for like atmosphere, or like really making a scene look really pretty or really horrifying or whatever. Localization. This one's rare. In fact, there's been some talk about removing the localization category entirely. Haven't decided about that yet. But it's exactly what it sounds like. It's when something from a foreign language was very, very well localized into English, which is what we're playing it as. Because usually localization tends to be a negative, because usually localization sucks. See, that's the thing. That's one of the reasons why I'm hesitant to get rid of it, because there really is a difference between bad dialogue and bad localization, good dialogue and good localization. And we do want to be as nuanced as possible about the reviews. That's the whole point. Moments. Moments are a little bit different than cutscenes. Cutscenes are generally for things where you take your hand off the keyboard and just watch what's happening. A moment can be anything, though. A moment could be a really awesome boss fight, or even a specific time in a boss fight. Or maybe it's when you first crest that hill and look outside, when you first leave Vault 101 in Fallout 3, or when you first... Oh gosh, of course I'm trying to think of another example now. The very first time that you ever see the second half of the game in Final Fantasy VI, right? Moments are exactly what they sound like. MSQ, this is a term that came from Final Fantasy XIV, although that itself is a development of the term from Lotro, which was called Book Quests. MSQ stands for Main Story Quest. It is the primary, intended, mandatory content within a game. I say mandatory with an asterisk because, as any speedrunner will tell you, mandatory is a suggestion, not a rule. But it's what the developers intended to be the stuff you had to do in order to go through the quest. Usually this falls under the kind of thing of plot, but you get the idea. It's main story quests, right? Music direction. How well does a music add to a scene? Pretty obvious. NPC set dressing and limblom effect. Once again, part of the atmosphere, background kind of a thing. You see NPCs wandering around town, interacting with each other, talking, chatting. It feels like an actual place. That sort of a thing. That's NPC set dressing. Outro. I already talked about this, but just like the intro, the outro, where it starts, is variable, and how well it nails it is very important. And again, I am very harsh about intros and outros. Pacing. Self-explanatory. The pace at which a story develops and moves forward, and how well it's done. Padding. Once again, fairly explanatory. Padding is one of those always bad kind of a things. Plot. Is the core plot of a given game good? Is it something that's interesting or relevant or whatever? Party absence and limitation. What the heck is that for? Oh. Aha. Okay. That's actually a defunct category. Developing the meta before your eyes. I'm deleting it from the spreadsheet right now. I apologize. I actually meant to do this earlier. As anybody who knows me knows, spare time is not something I have a lot of right now. Prime opt, or primary optional. Prime opt is exactly what it sounds like. It's primary content, but it is optional. It's not considered mandatory. That's it. Mass Effect 2 and the squad loyalty missions, for example. You don't have to do those. The guild quests in Oblivion, doing the Fighters Guild or the Mages Guild, stuff like that. That's prime opt. It's still meat content. It's still something that's significant and relevant and is intended to be primary content, but you don't have to do it. Princess Peach segments. We don't see a lot of these, but these are named after Princess Peach. The whole point is a sequence where you play as something or someone substantially different. So the gameplay is noticeably different, and it adds to the narrative by virtue of the fact that you have switched perspectives. Secondary. So this is the final line in content. There's MSQ for primary mandatory, primary optional for primary optional, and secondary, which is exactly what it sounds like. Secondary can cover a fairly wide gamut of things, but if you see one random quest in town to go pick up 10 flasks of oil, that might be a secondary quest. Secondary quests are still quests, however. They're still content and still count. There is one thing not even on this list, which I call tasks. Tasks are like the billboard missions in Lotro or in Dragon's Dogma. There's no meat there, there's no content there, there's nothing to review. They are pure padding filler. Sound design. Obvious. How well does the sound design add to the narrative and to the scenes? Usually an atmosphere thing, like in, say, Prey or Subnautica or the Thief series. Story sequencing. This is one that I've noticed a lot of people get stumbled over because even though most people understand it once I explain it, because most people don't care about story sequencing, probably because Hollywood movies suck at this. Story sequencing is what I call the connecting threads in between moments. A lot of stories, I'm sure you can think of one right now off the top of my head, have like moment. They're even good moments, but there's no logic or flow between getting from point A to point B. That's your story sequencing right there. And even good games and good stories can have really bad story sequencing where things just kind of happen with no rhyme or reason to them. Storyboarding. Storyboarding is the process of figuring out, all the blocking and the movement and the animation. It has to do with choreography and stuff like that, how the scene is set. Storyboarding is usually really obvious when it's good and extremely obvious when it's bad. Looking at you, Just Cause 4. Storytelling mechanics. This is stuff that's usually kind of a gameplay thing that enables you to get more story, more lore, and more whatever. Like the codex entries in Mass Effect, or like being able to, in like Baldur's Gate 3 or Tyranny, being able to click something and get a little pop-up that says, here's an explanation for this. That's the kind of thing that goes under storytelling mechanics. Themes. That should be obvious. The theme of the work, or themes of the work. Visual continuity. This is a strange one. Visual continuity can be a good thing, but usually is a bad thing. It has to do with how well laid out the visual design is of certain areas and zones, and how they logically lead into each other. Otherwise, what happens is the player gets a sensation of being not lost so much as they don't actually have a feel for where they are relative to where they were. The mental map doesn't exist because there's no logic and flow, no continuity, in between the zones or areas or levels, and so they're just kind of bouncing around. Visual storytelling. Obvious. Let's say you're going through, because a lot of people question me about this, actually, so I shouldn't say obvious. What's the difference between visual storytelling and brickwork? So let's say you have a gorgeous, beautiful corridor, pristine, right? Near perfect, very, very clean, you can look at it and you can almost smell the pine in the air, right? That's brickwork. Now imagine the same corridor, but there's this long gash that's going along it, like someone just scraped some claws along it, and you happen to be walking in that direction towards whatever made that gash. That's visual storytelling. Make sense? Voice acting. Obvious. Voice direction. This is less obvious. Voice direction I usually give positives for or negatives for when an entire cast has issues, or when it's clear that the actor in question didn't really know what kind of scene they were in. So, if you've ever seen a scene where someone's like, oh my gosh, I wonder what's going on over there, as they're falling through an inferno from like the sky or whatever, that's bad voice direction. The director did not do the job of telling the actor, here's the scene, here's where you should be at, headspace-wise, to say this line. World building. Again, obvious. This is all about the world, the nature of it, the politics, the culture, all that fun stuff. And finally, just plain old-fashioned writing, which is the most catch-all category and picks up all the stuff that nothing else catches. Elements of the narrative that otherwise aren't there. And that's the story axis. I've decided to, just now, because I just looked down and saw that I've been talking for 18 minutes, to divide these into two separate videos. So I hope you enjoyed that discussion on the story axis.